Been there, played that, completed it. When it comes to big franchises and games, I can confidently say that I've experienced some of the best that video games have to offer. From epic adventures to carefully curated indie titles, I feel incredibly lucky to do what I do for a living. But there are still some games and series that slip through the cracks, and for me, Grandia is one of those series. It honestly was not an RPG franchise that was really on my radar, but with the first 2 games in the series recently being remastered for the Nintendo Switch, I decided to give it a shot. Grandia has a rich and in-depth combat system, one of the best of its generations, but that unfortunately can be mostly ignored with no consequences. However, it also features some of the most well-written and well-defined relationships in a JRPG, which made the whole experience worth it. Come with me on this journey as I complete Grandia from the GRANDIA HD Collection for the Nintendo Switch, right here on The Completionist, where we don't just beat the games, we complete them. When a game from 20 years ago gets remastered, one of the first questions I ask myself is, why this one? Grandia makes a great case for itself, and it's one of the best experiences I've had with a new JRPG in a while. Well, not new, it's an older one, new for me, but you know what I mean.
Here comes a new challenger! Yes! Danger!
So I have played a ton of JRPGs over the years. Some of them haven't aged very well, but Grandia, even though it's over 20 years old at this point, still holds up. There's plenty in it that feels dated, but mostly it feels timeless. It's the rare older video game that I went into pretty cold and came out on the other side as a fan. Grandia was unfortunately released in the US between some of the biggest RPGs of all time, and though it might have been a little overlooked, it does a ton of stuff to make it a noteworthy and memorable title. Grandia is a pretty traditional JRPG. Plucky kids, a fantasy world, NPCs to chat with, sprawling towns, monster battles where characters level up and learn new skills. Grandia was a hit in Japan, released on the Sega Saturn in late 1997. It was popular enough to earn a re-release on the PlayStation 2 years later in 1999. But Grandia never really went mainstream in the same way that a lot of RPGs released around that time did. Grandia came out in the US pretty much in between Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, so it's easy to see why Grandia might have been a little overshadowed. My first experience with Grandia was right after finishing Final Fantasy VII for the first time, and I don't think I was really ready for what Grandia was going for. Final Fantasy VII was an epic in scope and had more of a dark tone, whereas Grandia was all about the relationships and was generally more lighthearted. Looking at it now, I genuinely appreciate the earnestness that Grandia is going for throughout. Like most role-playing adventures, Grandia starts off small. Main character Justin is a young guy who yearns to be an adventurer just like his absent father. He wants to see the world, explore ancient ruins, and discover new and exciting things wherever he goes. But when exploring some ruins near his hometown of Parm with his neighbor Sue, he stumbles upon the nefarious Garlisle forces sacking the area. From there, he heeds the summons of mysterious stranger Lighthearted, and it's off to see the rest of the world. It isn't just the plot and characters that help Grandia stand out. The battle system is incredibly forward-thinking, and developer Game Arts took inspiration from the active time battle concept of other RPGs and made it better. Grandia was one of the first RPGs to really play with the ATB system, and after finally experiencing the combat at length for myself, I was impressed by how strong it is at its best. The characters and story are great, and the battles are fun even when they're easy, which was enough to inspire me to complete the game, which is good because other than the main plot and a handful of optional dungeons, there isn't all that much to this remaster. The Grandia HD Collection is not a remake set of games, it's simply a port. Publisher Gung Ho basically took the original first 2 games and put a fresh coat of paint on them. Nothing was added to pad out the experience, it's literally just the first 2 games. And that, my friends, is not a bad thing. I loved being able to experience Grandia all the way through for the very first time. Grandia has a very vocal fan base for a ton of reasons. The world is gorgeous and vibrant, and the characters are completely charming. But the way this game's combat holds up for a game that's over 20 years old is really unbelievable. Grandia's combat mechanics and leveling systems are incredibly innovative, forward-thinking, and just plain good. But with the exception of a handful of boss fights, this game is so easy. Players are rarely encouraged to take advantage of its own great features. Now, most RPGs consist of two phases: exploration and fighting. Grandia falls into this as well. When I wasn't talking to NPCs in town and getting bits and pieces of the overarching story, I was dungeon crawling my way through pretty involved dungeons to level up my characters and find items. These dungeons showcase something that I don't usually ask for when I play JRPGs. I genuinely wish the battles were longer or more complicated so that I could wring more out of the systems that the game presented me with. So Grandia's best and most enduring concept is the initiative point gauge, or the IP bar, that shows up in the bottom right of the screen during battles. This bar has tiny character portraits and enemy indicators that are constantly moving forward and showing you whose turn is up next. It's a quick and easy way to strategize and where the game's most awesome battle ideas take place. So if a party member manages to land a hit on an enemy, the enemy is pushed back on the IP bar. If one of my characters managed to bop an enemy with a critical hit right before they were about to take an action, their action would then be cancelled completely. And this process works both ways. There were plenty of fights where my moves or spells were cancelled because I thought I was fast enough to fire off a move before taking a hit. This system is why people still say that Grandia has one of the best battle systems of any RPG. And I'm inclined to agree to a point. I loved cancelling enemy attacks, getting through battles unscathed with my great timing, but the further I got into this game and the more I leveled up, the more I realized that this game didn't really demand all that much of me combat-wise. Yes, I wanted to work harder while I played through this game. This is probably the only time you'll ever hear me say that about an RPG. Grandia's combat is revelatory and has genuinely fun and interesting concepts, but because it's overall a pretty easy game, I never had to strategize. After a little unintentional grinding early on to learn some new skills, I was pretty overpowered for the rest of the game. Oops. Now, the way leveling up in this game works is that not only do characters earn overall experience that raise all their stats, they also raise stats by leveling up individual skills. Every time I leveled up a weapon, it raised a certain skill and gave me bonus stats. Essentially, the more I used a weapon, the more powerful that weapon became. Same deal with magic spells. I guess practice really does make perfect. Or in this case, practice makes battles a cinch because it was easy to grind and power up my characters without really trying to. Note that I said, for the most part, battles didn't give me any trouble. Normal encounters are pretty simple, but the boss fights in this game can be rough. But it's also where I was able to use the most strategy, and that felt exhilarating. There's an optional dungeon boss called the Kung Fu Master that I battled for half an hour because he kept healing himself. Yet I was able to prevent his most powerful attacks by directing my party to use critical strikes and force him back in the initiative lineup. I loved the back and forth nature that the best boss fights in this game have. The skill and spell system in this game is really transparent, which I appreciated because it led to a great completion roadmap right there on the pause menu. I knew that if I raised my fire to level 19 and my wind to level 15, I would learn a powerful new spell. And the best way to raise those levels was to find groups of enemies and blast them with the same spells over and over again. And by the time I was only halfway through this game, Justin and Fina, the two party members I used the most, had already learned nearly all of their skills. And because raising the level of an element also gives characters bonus stats, my characters were strong boys and girls. I liked that I was constantly progressing, but I wish there were a few more skills that Justin and Fina picked up to use in the late game. So the way characters learn spells in this game is by spending a currency called a mana egg on new elements. One egg equals one new element for one character. If the game had been a little more stingy with the eggs, maybe it would have made earning the spells feel a little more difficult, but since I was able to pass them around like leftover Halloween candy at a house party, my party members were able to crank up their stats no problem. I loved that all the enemies were out in the overworld while I explored, but again, it made combat even simpler. I could run past enemies if I wanted to, but the way this game is designed, it's almost always better to battle and gain experience points. Once I got good at really surprising enemies by approaching them from the backside, it was over. I didn't have to worry about pushing back enemies on the IP bar because I was always going first anyway. It was always satisfying to get that first strike in though. Now, this might make it sound like most fights are boring, but they really aren't. Battles with random enemy monsters are turn-based but never static. The battle theme in Grandia is pumping, which I think is a crucial part to any RPG. I love that instead of everyone standing in a line and smacking each other with weapons, everybody on the battlefield just kind of runs all over the place. There are even advantages and disadvantages to where characters go on the battlefield. But again, outside of some epic boss battles, this idea never really reaches its full potential. If you want, you can direct party members to flee to different parts of the battlefield to avoid attacks, or try and position characters near each other to get the most out of a buff. But pretty quickly, I learned spells and skills that hit every enemy on the battlefield, no matter how far away from them I was, or learned buffs that raised everyone's stats all at once. Grandia kept teasing me like this, giving me glimpses of a battle system that could be much more complex or robust if enemies were just a little more dangerous, or if grinding was kept more in check. I never really had to strategize to get through the main plot. The combat system is really cool, but you don't have to use the whole bag of tricks to beat the game. I could just kind of blast through it at my leisure. And since at every save point I could recover all my HP and MP, there was never any reason to ration my spells. I could go full out and use my most powerful spells in every battle if I was near a save point, and then just run back and recover. It was cheesy, but still really fun. I think that's the most surprising thing. I still had a ton of fun with this game's combat. It's fast-paced, even though the spell animations are a little long. Leveling up the spells is great, and I liked that I knew what I was working towards at any given moment. In other RPGs with long dungeons, I sometimes hold off on using magic since I didn't want to use up elixirs or what have you. But in Grandia, I just let it rip, which was really empowering. Now, I talked about in pretty good length about how easy it is to grind in this game, but that's definitely due in part to playing Grandia on the Nintendo Switch. I'm talking about a little spell called Time Gate, which is learned by Fina after leveling up both her wind and water skills and reaching a certain point in the story. So in the PlayStation version of this game, Time Gate was learned after leveling up both of those skills to level 99 each. Now this would take forever. No other skills for any other characters in the game would require this high of a level. However, in the HD collection, this has been adjusted, and based on my research, I saved myself about 90 hours of grinding. Now, don't get me wrong, there's still a good amount of grinding to be done in Grandia, but now Time Gate is actually usable and not a ridiculously nearly unreachable goal to hit. And frankly, I'm surprised more modern games haven't ripped off this battle system or tweaked it even. It's that good even 22 years after the game first debuted in Japan. Developers of indie darling Child of Light specifically cite the Grandia series as an inspiration, but it seems to me like RPGs could definitely take a page or two out of Grandia's book. Battles in this game are always interesting and fast-paced, even when they're easy, and I feel like a more difficult game with the same combat could really be satisfying. Grandia has some amazing gameplay ideas all throughout. The combat system is incredibly good and real smart, but the game didn't really push me that hard until some of the late-game boss fights. It's still fantastic, but if the game itself were just slightly more demanding throughout the adventure, then the great foundation introduced could get a chance to really shine. So I was a little disappointed with how Grandia's combat doesn't get a real chance to catch up to its potential. But what wasn't disappointing and kept me smiling softly throughout this game were the characters and story. Grandia absolutely nails the sense of adventure that you'd expect from a great role-playing game, and has some of the most well-written and well-defined character relationships of any RPG. It's always weird playing an RPG for the first time. I'm basically waiting for my characters to experience the call to action to save the world, and you can only save the world so many times in so many different games before you start becoming numb to it all. But Grandia's stakes start out comparatively low, which gave me a chance to just kind of love these characters. The relationships are great. Something that's unique about Grandia is that characters tend to come in and out of your party throughout this game pretty frequently, so there's always new perspectives or different personalities clashing off of each other. Characters talk to each other in a way that just clicked for me. It's maybe the first RPG where globe-trotting kids actually talk and act like kids. They aren't burdened with the fate of humanity or dealing with existential crises. They're talking about how old people just don't get it, man, and navigating awkward crushes. The tone alternates between serious and goofy, and it works nicely. There's a moment early on where the main character Justin leaves his childhood home because, you know, it's adventure time, dang it, but decides not to tell his mom that he's leaving. Later, while he's on a boat, he opens and reads a sealed letter she wrote for him to pass off to someone else. She talks about her son's good qualities and how someday he'll be a great adventurer, and then goes on to scold Justin for reading this letter that she very specifically told him not to open. She goes on to tell him that she loves him and will miss him, and it struck me as a nice and honest moment. Some of the writing can sometimes be a little hokey and jokey, and the voice acting is definitely a product of its time.
Oh, Justin, not you again. You just don't learn trashing my shit again.
I didn't trash it. Why won't you listen to me?
But for the most part, I loved how the game took its time and established how characters felt about each other. Even NPCs are pretty well written and have several lines of dialogue each. There's a lot of variety to be found in the villages and the people that inhabit them. And what's crazy is that there's very rarely anything to actually do in any given village besides buy new gear and advance the next plot point. But I love that the towns and villages were packed with characters who loved to chat and expand my understanding of the world. Grandia made me feel adventurous because the world felt huge. Some story moments are genuinely awe-inspiring, like when the party first scales the mind-bogglingly large end of the world, a wall that is supposedly impassable. But after ascending floor after floor and defeating dozens of enemies, my party finally reached the top and had a quiet moment taking in the landscape. Quiet moments really mean something in this game. The relationship between Fina and Justin is full of quiet moments that show how the two slowly start to fall for each other. Justin starts off totally oblivious, but over the course of adventure after adventure, starts to worry less about becoming a famous hero and more about taking care of those close to him. The way the two fall for each other feels natural, or as natural as any video game love story can feel. I'd say the writers did the best with what they had. Now, I do want to briefly mention that I did have a couple of little graphical hiccups during dialogue scenes. This wasn't any sort of deal breaker by any means, as I was always drawn back in by the dialogue, but it did stick out to me a few times. Now, of course, it wouldn't be a JRPG without a flamboyant set of villains. But even with this trope, Grandia does a great job subverting expectations. Yes, Big Bad General Bale is after an ancient power that will give him the power to remake the world how he wants because this is a JRPG, but there are some fantastic story beats leading up to that. I know a bunch of people are probably just getting into Grandia for the first time because of the HD Collection, but I think Grandia's take on sibling rivalry is really cool and complex. The 3 secret dungeons found in the back half of the game are entirely optional unless you want some really powerful items to equip on your party members. I think this lack of padding is to the game's benefit because it keeps the pacing pretty tight. Playing Grandia, there were moments where I genuinely felt like a kid again. I always wanted to know what was going to happen next because the writing was so strong, funny, and honest. The relationships felt real, even in a world full of fantasy. It's an incredibly heartfelt game, and I can see why it has such a passionate fan base after all these years. There isn't a whole lot of extra stuff to do in Grandia. It's a really linear RPG, and entire areas of the game are closed off after you visit them for the first time. But there is one significant reward in the form of this game's final bonus, an after-credits epilogue. But that's seriously it. I unlocked every skill and found the best items in the optional dungeons, but there isn't anything left to unlock after this. This scene isn't even a reward for anything other than defeating the final boss and sitting through the credits. But for all of that, I loved it. Getting a little piece of closure at the end of the game was a perfect little button. I thought I would feel disappointed that there wasn't more for Completionists in this game, but really, I can't think what they would add. Completing this game is easy if you have the time, and a great story with satisfying character arcs is as good as a reward as I could have hoped for. When I completed Grandia, there were 18 mana eggs found. I didn't need all of these to teach my character spells, but I liked that there were extras in case I had missed any while exploring. 3 optional dungeons completed, earning me some great weapons and items that helped accelerate my grind. 8 playable characters, some of whom left my party forever just after a short time, further cementing the feeling that time is a devastating force that only marches forward. Over 63 hours played with 0 game overs because I stayed on my grind and was a little overpowered by the end. And one extremely sweet epilogue that made me go, aww, even though in my career I've seen everything. This game just punched me right in the heart and in the nuts and made me feel things, damn it. I really enjoyed completing Grandia. It has some areas where it shows its age, but there's something to be said for experiencing the classics. I didn't find the little graphical issues to be game-breaking, and I had a fantastic time with the game. I wish there had been a few more completion bonuses, but the story and the characters are wonderful. And even though only certain boss fights really push it to the limit, Grandia's battle system is legendary. If you've been wanting to experience an epic adventure or are feeling burnt out on grim and gritty character dramas, give Grandia a shot and be transported. So, With that in mind, guys, I give this game my completionist rating of finish it.
Finish it!
That's all the time we have for today, guys, so please, as always, let us know what you thought about today's episode somewhere on the internet. If you like the show, do me a favor, hit that like button. If you like the Nintendo Switch, hit that like button. If you like JRPGs, you better hit that like button. At the very least, I've been Jordan the Completionist. Hit the subscribe button while you're at it. Hit the bell to get all notifications. We do new videos every Wednesday and Saturday. New videos Wednesdays and Saturday. I've been Gerard. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.